Hello there, and welcome to Weird Music on the Glumberger channel. This is of course a show where that really weird, unusual presenter just talks about a different album each and every week mostly. So today we are finally introducing an album that was first mentioned, all the way back in the early days of the Glumberger channel, even prior to the Weird Music series. This is an album I truly adore. One that has accompanied for many years since I first discovered it, that just offers up this incredibly gentle, serene experience that I find so soothing and so relaxing. It's interesting, it was one of my major introductions to the record label it comes from, 12K, and has been quite an influence on me in terms of the kind of things I wish I could be doing in music, essentially, in terms of just expressing serenity through unusual approaches to improvisational ambient music. I'm incredibly excited to be discussing this one today, as I've wanted to try write about this for an incredibly long time. Finally got around to it. So without further ado, I present On Falling by Marcus Fischer. So, of course, who is Marcus Fischer then? Well, Marcus Fischer is an interdisciplinary artist and musician from Portland, Oregon. And when it comes to his music, Fischer has mostly featured his releases on Taylor Dupree's wonderful record label 12K, both as a solo performer and as well with a few collaborations with the likes of Dupree himself and even Simon Scott of Slowdive. On top of this though, Fischer has more recently been designing the album artworks for some of the past few releases on 12K, some as recent as the ones released this year actually. Fischer has approached the world of art in a very interesting way, sort of this collage aesthetic kind of thing, and has made some very nice artworks. A favourite of mine perhaps being Low Flying Owls by Between. When it comes to Fischer's music though, it is ambient music that comes from this wonderful place of accidental improvisation, using experimental techniques, to create these rather unusual textures that then become redefined through his own processes, utilising not just guitars and tape loops, but even a few found objects and a few, unusual stringed instruments, resulting in these very wonderful site-specific performances, apparently. And so what is On Falling then? Well, this is a very interesting release from Fischer, a roughly hour-long set comprised of some home recordings that I believe made up the bulk of the kind of music Fischer was presenting at the time it was composed. Just to go into it briefly, originally On Falling was only available in an incredibly limited number of 25 copies, sold during Fischer's UK tour in either 2019 or 2018, I'm not entirely sure, with Hotel Neon and Simon Scott. Fast forward a little bit though, and On Falling got this loving re-release on Taylor Dupree's 12K though, as a limited edition cassette that combined the original recordings on side A and a live performance on side B. So, without a doubt, it's one of my favourite ambient releases I've ever come across, and as mentioned, one of my first introductions to the record label 12K, as my discovery of the label led me to their Bandcamp page many years ago, where I found myself looking at all of the album art and just being drawn to this quaint little image of the sky hid behind green leaves of the trees. I remember wanting to discover it and finding it very odd hearing the first few instances of notes from this album when it first occurred. But But I've since listened to it so many times though, and it's without a doubt one of the most comforting ambient balms to exist within the genre, I find. It's just this beautiful, effortless drift into the soft, warm seasons of the day, it feels, watching the leaves gently fall from those trees. As mentioned, I have genuinely wanted to present this album on the show ever since the early days of trying to review music on YouTube, as this album was also mentioned in the Defunct Homes for Drones video as well, where I just presented 10 of my favourite ambient albums at that time. So yeah, I'm really pleased to finally be presenting this on Weird Music, so let's dive into it all, shall we? So opening up with Debris, we get this peculiar metallic scraping of instruments to start off the entire thing. Very magnetic almost, just the scraping of the strings, with it playing this esoteric, peculiar interaction of notes, it feels though, where certain sounds get thrown into odd delay effects, and it slowly just rises up from that sort of, the debris, essentially, pulling itself together, with this beautiful sound palette, revealing ambient layers that play through so beautifully, like the very spectres of those very strings on that guitar. And there's this beautiful sort of randomness to how Fischer achieves this by, sitting with the guitar and playing with these various loops and pedals and various objects as well that interact with the guitar strings. And it becomes this incredibly rich tapestry that's a constantly changing experience, guided by the melancholy weight of that guitar that so sadly tries to, play that melody of sorts found within that bed of ambience. I find it so pretty, and I just love how it all unfolds so incredibly slowly from what is arguably almost abrasive sounds in the very opening, that raw sound of scraping metal strings here. But then from there it becomes interpreted by all of these various effects pedals, resulting in this beautiful swell of ambient music. I always find it incredibly breathtaking. The change becomes so subtle, but and it becomes even more subtle the more it all progresses here. The more, as it all occurs though, the more distinctly ambient and almost lowercase it becomes though. A very experimental branch of ambient music, I feel, that adheres to such strange rules and conventions perhaps, like pure randomness just occurring over the length of this composition, resulting in something so just beautiful, I find. And it results in this incredibly somber, gentle musical journey of intimate occurrences happening just by sheer chance, it feels, The most unique sound instances that produced from the myriad of effects that Fischer pulls it all through. And I find myself just in awe of how special it all sounds to me, though, a sort of melancholy musing that ponders over a peculiar sort of existentialism here. I think it's an incredibly cool and beautiful thing, and Fischer, as a result of this particular approach to music, has made some of the most wonderful music as a result of this untethered experimentation. Of course, moving along to the next track, we get track 2, Watching Snow. And so very slowly you get this droning melody emerging from that sea of white noise, the moving of cassettes and loops, it feels, and just tape effects, before the drones become much more dominant here, really holding further and further with each new note, it feels. And there's a kind of rising intensity to how the music feels as it pulls on those incredibly long notes, it feels, like the faint interference that kind of falls into the mix the more this one just drifts slowly past. And it's so distinctly low-end and drony, yet so oddly experimental with its sound palette, opting for the most odd moments of pure static at times, it feels. It's odd because it becomes that favourite thing of mine in ambient music, that interplay between two distinctly heard halves, both coming together in this unified form. The relationship between two sounds occurring together as music. And with how Fischer sources these sound instances from just pure randomness of just approaching his instruments and his collection that he's got in front of him, using this array of effects and loops to just further pull it all into the infinitesimal, it feels. There's something just so delightful about it. And on this one, it's just so drifty and just so gentle and somber as it just pulls you into that ambient slumber. And it's like, after that sort of metallic opening track of, the dirt and debris and the earth and stuff, it's kind of now descending into, just fluffy white snow almost, until you end up with the next track of While Sleeping. And so this one, you get guitar notes pulling so slowly on delay effects that echo out so beautifully, though, I find. And it all just bounces along so gently into that peculiar state of slumber where you're half asleep, still hearing, still listening, but falling into the pull of those dream worlds. Like, I think whenever I'm listening to music of this sort, I'm generally always like falling asleep at the time. I love to listen to ambient music when I want to drift off, essentially. And I always find in these instances, I'm always visiting the album art in some form when I close my eyes. And in this instant, just that vignette of the sky through the trees, it feels, And I find myself getting pulled into the centre of it all as the music just plays all around you, just throwing further and further down these amazing delay effects, looping back on these beautiful droning instances. Like, it's amazing how when the music becomes much more strange and intense, just building up and up though, you're drawn right towards it all, that it slowly becomes almost more tumultuous, before falling right back into those lovely drones. You get that sort of ebb and pull of it, if that makes sense. And it's like slowly slipping out of consciousness piece by piece in these peculiar loops of music. Like, I think it's so lovely, especially how this one just occurs, it's always been one of my favourites for its strange explosion of delay effects, I feel, and that beautiful palette of guitar-led ambient, of course. And there's something so delightfully comforting about that level of gentle melancholy that makes it so lovely and calming. And the sheer effects that this particular track has when I hear it is, why it's one of my top favourite things off of this album, essentially. Like, it's so gentle, so experimental, and the kind of thing I just think is so cool in music, just exploring all of that for as long as you feel is necessary, and especially with how delay pedals can just loop things over and over, just echoing it down through the pedal effects, essentially. It just results in some of the coolest sound instances, I find, and this is something I've tried to explore in my own approaches to music, especially playing around with delay effects, just how long you can just delay notes for and just let it go over and over and over. And it feels like this one really sort of captures that sort of randomness of accidental occurrences that are a result of this experimenting with these kind of pedal effects and all of these different effects that Fischer utilises in the composition here. Like, it's, for me, just one of my favourite things off this album, and just one of my favourite tracks. To move along again, we have one more from side A here, From a Tree. So, after everything we've heard, you end up with this one final track on this side, where you get very dense ambient layers, set against that backdrop of gentle field recording of the birds, it seems. Kind of like another look towards the trees as the various effects start to take a hold of those loops and throw them down towards uncertainty as they play back around once more. And I think out of all the tracks, this is perhaps the most ambient of all the compositions, though, like it's managed to dig down even deeper than any of its predecessors, exploring new depths of that delay pedals that submerge it all the more further and further, throwing it further down than you could ever imagine, I find. But I just adore how distinctly ambient it is, although it's just so very gentle and droning before throwing in these more intense notes that decline so heavily. Like, it's an odd thing, because this album, when I hear it, it just slowly drifts you with each and every track, just pulling you into that drift, and it's always by this point I'm just so lost with all the layers of ambient music fun, so it's difficult to really hone in on my thoughts on this one, because I'm always just in awe of what I'm hearing, I find. And with this one, it is definitely perhaps the most drifty of all of them, as it's like it seems to just occur for only the briefest of moments, these little motifs within the very layers of the drones, but there's so many beautiful notes within it, though, and stuff, like, especially those ones that decline so heavily at times. And it's strange how the album seems to naturally follow this logical progression almost, it explores all these very strange effects and results, even within experimental music. Like, it starts off with very direct sort of sound instances, the scraping of those strings, and then by the time it's guided itself to this track, the fourth one, it's like it's pulled it all even further and further, just stretching it outwards, creating such wonderful beds of ambient music. Like, I think it's very amazing to experience, I find, and it's very experimental, but yet still so nice and ambient in its own right, and just such perfectly occurring music as a result of all of Marcus Fischer's experimentation here. Like, it's just such a truly beautiful ambient album, I find. So we then flip over the cassette here, actually, and we get one more track. So we can get comfortable now, because I'm going to use this time to explain, as much as I can about this album, and just go into a few anecdotes here. So this is the longest song in the album. So let's start with the song itself. The next track of On April 29th. So this is a live recording that sees Fischer combining guitar, tape loops, modular synthesizer, and field recordings. And at 29 minutes in length, this is the longest track on the album, of course. A very strange ambient drone experience to close off this whole thing. And so this performance, essentially it combines all of those various elements that occurred in all of the first four tracks, it feels, You start off with that very same metallic scraping of the very strings on the guitar, though, where we're then led on an additional journey into the wonderful world of pure happenstance, where the various interaction between the instrument itself, the effects of the pedals, and the introduction of new droning layers, it creates an incredibly strange ambient experience that slowly grows from the genesis of something very unusual, it feels. And before long, it just slowly develops, it builds and builds and builds until you get to one of Fischer's most loveliest motifs that he plays on the guitar. Like, this is a bit of an unusual thing that I will try my best to explain here, but as this one starts to open up after that sort of odd little opening, he starts playing this little part on the guitar there that is just a little motif, perhaps. This beautiful little collection of notes that sounds so wistful, melancholy, and existential, and I swear this is something that actually transcends a bunch of his recordings. Like, I was recently re-listening to Shape Memory by Marcus Fischer and Simon Scott, the collaborative album they made, and I swear the same motif rears its head within that very album itself, but I will have to really delve in and discover that when we review that album, if we review it. I sure hope we can do. But it's odd though, because I don't know why, but every time I hear that little guitar part, I'm just so comforted for some reason. Like, it just feels like such a little expression of Marcus Fischer himself, perhaps, in the form of just music and the instrument itself. But it's lovely because this little guitar pattern, it emerges from the very sounds of growing synthesis, and it's one that's so lovely and intimate, that creates this lovely bed of ambience that feels like a growing swirl of sounds all emerging out of that miasma, out of the darkness itself. It's so nice, and I find it just so lulling and relaxing as it pulls me in and out of the structure of the very composition, itself, before travelling all the way back down towards it, Like, it's odd, but it's a very serene environment created by those looping drones, and you find yourself just falling into the recesses of it, though, as Fischer subtly shifts the focus away as these new sounds emerge over the peculiar loop of clean guitar there. Like, it's such a lovely moment that it all navigates to, and it takes a very long time to get there, and what I think what I love about it is that I do find it odd to tell what, when listening to Marcus Fischer, what parts of the songs I hear perform with the instruments, or what's playing with the loops or playing with the pedals. Like, at times he just blurs that so well, unless you have the context of literally sitting down there and watching him do this thing. Hearing it on a physical release, a bit trickier, of course, especially when it comes to a live composition, it's even odder. But that's just a cool thing when it comes to ambient music, I find, though, especially when listening to live recordings. There's this knowledge for me that, this being a long-form improvisation of sounds, that this is how it all sounded and occurred for the 29 minutes of that particular live setting. And just to quickly interject, it's worth quickly discussing the Bandcamp liner notes here, as it gives us a little context on how this live performance came about, if that makes sense, of course, as well as giving us a little bit more context for the rest of the album, why not? So, yeah, just a brief interjection before we get back to discussing the album itself. Marcus Fischer's On Falling was originally self-released as a tour cassette in the fall of 2018. 12K is proud to offer this new version that contains the original release on side A, combined with a 30-minute live recording on side B. Marcus is known for his releases of carefully constructed studio works and tape manipulation, yet his process also embraces randomness, incidental and found sounds. On Falling is an exploration of the latter techniques that allow for improvisation and capture the results in a single stereo take. This reproduces the experience of his live performances. The improvised work on Falling is as captivating as Fischer's studio work. The presence of physical contact between body and instrument with musical notes that undulate in the stereo field, never resolving the same way. Despite the irregular nature of his compositions, the music is patient and gentle while staying alert and engaging. Fischer's acoustic instrumentation and understanding of the digital and tape manipulation process makes the nature of the sounds something new entirely, something that falls outside of standard definitions. The live performance of On April 29th, presented on the B side of the cassette, contains many of the elements found on the first 4 tracks: guitar, tape loops, modular synthesizer and field recordings, as well as the voices from one of Fischer's installations. For this performance, Marcus focused on textures centered around extended guitar techniques. Using objects placed under and on top of strings, he creates sympathetic overtones, transforms his guitar sound into a chorus of bells beneath pipe organ drones. Amid dusty musical passages and the swells of his prepared guitar, the performance draws to a close in a wash of analog tape delay from a repurposed reel-to-reel recorder. 12K presents On Falling as a limited edition of 100 cassettes, which will live on in digital and streaming formats. I think it's very cool and delightful how Fischer got it all to sound just like this. Like this weird microcosm of the very aesthetics of the album itself, all being presented in a live context. I think it's so cool. Before long as it all develops though, this one actually does introduce an element that wasn't featured on any of the rest of the album though, and that is the introduction of a looped vocal sample reading a small passage. We get basically a vocal sample which was provided by Patricia Wolf, speaking words written by Alison Provax, saying what I believe is, all things change, maybe you already know, everything feels right. And then I swear maybe there's other things said in there, it's very hard for me to discern as it is just within this complete swirling bed of ambient music, but it doesn't really matter, it is just something that occurs within it. But these new sound occurrences happening alongside those drones and delay effects and loops, this voice repeating that phrase over and over though, and I think there's something so nice, pretty and profoundly existential about it though, and it's so nicely placed in amongst the layers of ambient loops, and I can't help but think about what is being said, or what I think is being said, the changing of everything, the lack of permeance to everything essentially, and the awareness of that, and even within that though, just finding peace and solace within it all. it's for me that kind of wistful existentialism presented in a few short lines of prose, the entropy of it all, our personal understanding of it, even within that constant state of flux, that everything is okay, and everything is alright, or will be alright. And I think it's for me, because I find ambient music so comforting, like, this just really comes across so nicely to me. Like, it's so odd, because, during these moments you have ambient music that moves like the very weather itself to help guide us through these rather strange transitions through life itself, And I find, as a result, my mind wanders so much when hearing such music like this, especially when it plays out for such long, lengthy run times. Like, it really just sets my existentialism going, and especially when my mind is starting to fetter and worry, like, hearing something like this, but the ambience and the spoken words, it just brings it all right back down to a calm centre. And now, easily one of my favourite things about this particular composition. So, it's an odd thing for me. I sometimes find that whenever I first discover an ambient record label, I find it so exciting going to discography and seeing the plethora of album art staring out at you. And as mentioned, one of the first that stood out to me was On Falling by Marcus Fischer. This oddly, this odd little picture of the leaves against the blue sky here. And I don't know why at the time, but I just felt so drawn to that though. Felt drawn to discover the music that was presented with this lovely combination of green and blues. It was perhaps that naturalistic element to the photo here, the quaint ordinariness of it all that intrigued me to begin with. And it's perhaps one of my favourite things that I adore about the ambient music genre. This is something that either has been discussed or will be discussed or is getting discussed in our video for A Piece of Stringer's Sunset by Dawn Sarger, also released on 12K, where the strangeness of that album art also drew me into discovering. Whereas that album is very weird and difficult to approach. This one is just a truly beautiful thing, I find. But it's that thing of, being pulled in by the artworks you're seeing when you're discovering record labels, discovering the plethora of secrets buried within these albums, presented to us as, just artworks essentially of experimental music. And it's something I have noticed so much when diving into the discographies of various record labels, I can think of so many off the top of my head, where, for me, it comes across this thing where all of those artworks represent these tiny little micro-worlds waiting to be discovered, providing you feel drawn into it, if that makes any sense. Like, I think I'm mentioning it here because discovering this album was a truly wonderful moment in my history of, enjoying ambient music, essentially. Like, I remember when I first sat down to play this one, finding that metallic scratching that opens it all up to be so odd and peculiar, like it was almost off-putting to begin with. But since listening to it, 100 times or so, I have no idea how many times I've heard this one. All those little details that seem almost unusual are now a very part of the character of this particular album. And as mentioned, one of my favourite ambient albums of all time, something I've listened to so much since first discovering it many years ago, and something that stuck with me, guided me, through tumultuous times when I've needed to find some inner peace and calm, as well as being quite an influence on my own approach to music composition, as I mentioned earlier on. The playing around with effects pedals, loopers, even cassette tapes is something I've started to discover recently. Not doing a good job of it, but, essentially discovering music through accidental processes. It's just a wonderful journey to take yourself on if you like to play music for yourself, essentially. And just that sheer happenstance resulting in these strange things, like the wonderful effect of experimentation. Like, I can't hold a candle to the work of Marcus Fischer, but I am truly indebted to his craft for at least offering me a gentle guiding push in certain directions, I find. But perhaps one more little anecdote to further illustrate this point there, before we close off. But when we were actually recording the final tracks for our debut album, as Bird Lives, the last song we all contributed to was the song Flutters. So the music of Bird and Limbs that I play for is, I describe it as, very angry, aggressive, cathartic, heavy music, essentially. It's very noisy and very dirgy and very intense. However, Flutters is without a doubt the most lightest and gentlest song we have released so far, like easily one of the most ambient things that we've ever recorded. In fact, when we were all chose a song to remix off the album, all the individual members of the band, I chose this track and turned it into like a 10-minute ambient drone track because it's what I feel in the song. Anyway, so unlike the rest of the album, which was generally recorded by the band together in a live setting, Flutters was the only song we recorded as overdubs, where we had our lead vocalist Chad Murray record the guitar part and those vocals to begin with, and then we all came in one by one to record parts over it. It's not a process we usually do, but due to the unnatural nature of how that song progresses, it was the only way we were going to get it done. So I was the last person to record my parts for this song, and I remember feeling such a level of anxiety rising over the course of this entire recording session, as I knew I wanted to contribute a lot of ambient layers to this recording, as it's essentially my favourite Bird and Limbs track. I really wanted to do this one proud. So I remember on the morning of my part for recording, I spent some time in the garden listening to On Falling by Marcus Fischer to help just guide me in the right directions. When it comes to the recording, I remember so little of it, as I often do, but I just remember so well feeling so grateful to Marcus Fischer for helping me calm me down when I was no doubt getting incredibly neurotic and overthinking everything, and just providing for me an avenue to guide the performance for that recording that you hear on the album today. I don't think it's anything special, don't get me wrong, but I just adored that it's in a weird way tangentially related to this particular album, which is hence why I want to discuss it in this episode. A small little anecdote, just because I want to express my thanks for it, if that makes sense. It's unusual. But with that, I think we have come to the end of our episode of Weird Music there. So, like I said, I'm so glad we're able to find the time to sit down with this album, and, I'm just glad I was able to finally write some thoughts about this and present it to you on the show here, of course. As you can see, I think, writing about this one, it kind of ran away from me a bit, but sometimes I think that's kind of cool how, you just want to explore and see where you go when you're writing these things. Now, when starting the writing process for the reviews, I actually have very little direction, the whole episode be headed in. It's one of the reasons why I adore making this show, as I get to discover the journey when making everything, when both writing it and then when editing it. In any case, though, I'm glad to have taken the time to discuss this one. It's without a doubt one of my favourite ambient albums of all time. It's just something I adore for so many reasons, as you all know, and something that just opened up the doors to ambient music in a way I never thought existed, essentially. And something I am now so honoured to own in a physical copy. It wasn't the easiest thing to get over here in the UK, but got it eventually. But yeah, if you want to check this one out, a link to it will be below in the comments, of course. There are also some links to some of Marcus Fischer's live performances as well, just to see a bit more about his craft and how he approaches the composition of music. But yes, I hope you have enjoyed watching today's episode of Weird Music. I wish you all the best. Take care, and bye-bye for now. Bye-bye.